Egunon, buenos días a todas y a todos. Welcome to this session of the Tartalo Festival and the Myth in the Arts Conference. It is my great honor, I would say privilege, to introduce you to Professor P.J. Matthews. P.J. Matthews is a professor of Irish literature, drama and culture at University College Dublin and director of the UCD Creative Futures Academy. He's the author of Revival, the Abbey Theatre, Sinn the Gaelic League and the Cooperative Movement, co-editor with Declan Keever of Handbook of the Irish Revival, editor of the Cambridge Companion to J.M. Singh, and executive producer of the feature documentary In Time Donald Lanny, which premiered at the Galway Film Festival in July 2025. Professor Matthews previously served as a Northern visiting professor of English at the University of Notre Dame, academic director of the W.B. Yeats Winter School in Sligo, and the Parnell Summer School in Avondale. I am just reading a brief bio note, but I was checking on the web about his impressive career, and definitely I would need at least half an hour to describe this properly. So I won't won't waste more time in this introduction. The title of his lecture today is Myth and Modernity, Reimagining Ireland in the Irish Revival. And definitely we are very happy to have you here, Professor P.J. Matthews. So when you wish, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Gracias, David. Encantado de estar aquí. En esta ciudad maravillosa, participando en este congreso fantástico en dos sentidos de la palabra. So, thank you everybody. Thank you for the warm welcome. Just before I start, I'd just like to say some thanks to people who have been so helpful and great scholars and great compañeros, I suppose we could say. So I'd like to thank Olga Fernandez for the invitation and the other directors of this great event. Aicer Altuna Garcia, también Richard Jorge Fernandez, someone who I know of old. Great to see you again, Richard. Raúl Montero, of course, the famous Raúl. Gracias por todo. And David, pleasure to meet you as well. So, let's begin. I want to talk to you this morning about the Irish Revival period, which is an extraordinary period of literary, artistic and cultural achievement in Ireland. It's also an intense period of social activism and intellectual awakening and political revolution. So there are kind of two fields of activity happening during this period. I want to talk to you about the role of myth and folklore and the supernatural, the fantastic in this crucial period of Irish cultural and political activity. And some of the points will, I hope, resonate with the wonderful presentation yesterday by Professor Antonio Ballesteros on the place of the Gothic in the Anglophone literature, which was really wonderful. Really enjoyed that. So hopefully there will be some alignment with that at some points. And to think about Ireland in this period as it's a period of modernization in which a turn to the past becomes a turn to the future. Okay, so that's kind of one of the major themes this morning. The idea of an alternative modernity. The idea that in Ireland during this time, tradition is often used as a springboard for innovation and change. So going back to the old traditions can also activate direction into the future. So let's begin. So just to make a few points at the outset, the revival, we're talking about 1891 to 1922. It's an extraordinary period of literary, cultural and political activity. It's formative in the evolution of the Irish state and the modern Irish consciousness. So if we in Ireland think of when did the Irish nation, when did the Irish state, where can we trace it back in its modern incarnation? It's this period that we look to. It's a phase, I would argue, of Irish enlightenment and intellectual rejuvenation. And I'll explain that in a few minutes. It's a period which witnesses the emergence of new civic energies outside of religion, outside of the British colonial state, and conventional politics. It's a time for new movements where intellectual exchange and artistic excellence were encouraged and where freedom of expression was upheld. But it's also a time of vigorous debates and clashes and conflicts about citizenship, dissent, personal liberty, education, political accountability, national sovereignty. All of these things are happening at this. So I don't want to give the impression that everything is nice and everybody's moving in the same direction and it's all fine. Lots of conflict also at this time. So an important point then is the role of art in society, or the role of the artist in society, is something to think about in this period. And one of my favorite quotes comes from one of the great writers, and I was talking to David about that, John Millington Synge, who is one of the great writers of this period. And I love this quotation from him. So he says, "What is highest in poetry is always reached where the dreamer is leaning out to reality, or where the man of real life is lifted out of it. And in all the poets, the greatest have both these elements, that they are supremely engrossed with life, and yet with the wildness of their fancy, they are always passing out of what is simple and plain." Now, what does he mean? What he means there is the best writers, the best poets, are of course dreamers, but they're dreamers who lean out to reality. In other words, the best literature, the best artistic creations always speak in some way to their moment, to their society, to the pressures of their own time. So if they're utterly divorced from that, well, there's something missing in his view. And also he said that for those people who are interested in the real world, the social organizers and the activists and so forth, they need to be lifted out of the real world into the world of the imagination a little bit. So there's an interesting thing happening in Irish culture at this time where the artists, the people of imagination, are connected to what's happening on the ground, and the people on the ground are connected to what's happening in the artistic realm. So there's a beautiful overlap happening in many respects. So very quickly, I'm not turning this into a history lesson, but to give you some kind of points and events to anchor some of my thoughts this morning. 1891 is the starting point because it represents the death of Charles Stewart Parnell, who was one of the great nationalist leaders during this period. And that's the end of something and the beginning of something else. So 1892, we have the founding of the National Literary Society. 1893, the founding of the Gaelic League. Now, the Gaelic League was an organization about not the preservation of the Irish language, but the use of the Irish language. So it marks a fundamental shift. Before this point, the Irish language was not widely, well, people were for all kinds of complicated reasons, losing their grip on the language. But at this point, we begin to see a change in attitudes towards the language, people beginning to speak it again and get interested in it again. Moving to 1904, the Abbey Theatre is founded. That's the national theatre in Ireland, the Abbey Theatre. And the theatre becomes, again, a very important locale where many of these ideas are manifested on stage. 1907, we get the production of Playboy of the Western World, one of the great plays of this period. And it was very controversial, so controversial that there were riots in the theatre. Some people were not happy with the play, and I'll explain a bit more about that. 1916, we have the Revolution, the Rising in Dublin. Then we have a War of Independence, and we have finally the foundation of the Irish state in 1922, which also coincides with the publication of Joyce's Ulysses. So that's just a few coordinates in terms of this period. Okay, so let's begin this journey. So we have to begin always when we talk about kind of the development of modern Ireland with the Great Hunger, the famine of the 1840s really, but reached a height in 1847. A catastrophic event which is still looms very large in the Irish consciousness, where 1 million people died of starvation and 1 million people emigrated. So this is the time of mass emigration. So this is an image from what they call the coffin ships or the famine ships. So this is the beginning of the Irish diaspora in the Anglophone world. So Irish people in their thousands going to London, going to the United States, going to Australia, and also going to places like Argentina as well, significant Irish diaspora, South America as well. So people leaving Ireland because of the catastrophe of the famine. And in 1898, we get one of our writers, Emily Lawless, writing an essay, Famine Roads and Famine Memory. So this is 50 years after the famine. She says, whenever I think of the Irish famine, there rises before me one particular spot in one particular corner of Connemara, one particular cluster of cabins, and yearly the slope on which they rest crumbles a little nearer to the sea. 50 years later, there are still traces of the famine everywhere present on the Irish landscape, but more importantly, in the Irish consciousness. There's a sense that this massive event is having its repercussions decades afterwards. And to a large degree, I think the Irish revival that we're going to speak about now is, in some respects, a response to the devastation of the famine and an attempt to try and overcome it in cultural ways. So, Antonio Ballesteros spoke very well about the Gothic yesterday and about the Irish presence in the Gothic. So we have Irish writers like Sheridan Le Fanu and Charles Maturin, and of course, most famously, Bram Stoker, writing really important Gothic literature in the 19th century. And we might say one of the reasons for that is because Ireland is a very Gothic place. You know, we literally have the Walking Dead after the famine. We also have a lot of the aristocracy, the old big houses of the aristocracy, the Anglo-Irish, are beginning to crumble and decline as that class comes to the end of its power in Ireland. So that's an interesting input into that. Speaking of the fantastic, and here's the Irish Frankenstein. So this is a view from London. What did London think of Ireland at this time? Well, it's encapsulated in this image. So you can see the figure with the hat is Daniel O'Connell, who was an Irish nationalist and also known for his work in relation to Catholic emancipation in Ireland, so getting the right of Catholics to vote in Ireland, is seen from London as a kind of Dr. Frankenstein, who's conjuring up this monster, this violent monster. You can see he has the stick, he's the horns coming from his head, and this is the Irish peasant. This is the Irish peasant class, who are largely illiterate at this time. So London creates this notion of fear around what's happening in Ireland because they're worried by this O'Connell character. And it happens again a couple of decades later. We have another Irish Frankenstein, but in this case, it's the man with the hat here is Charles Stewart Parnell, a later nationalist leader. But again, you can see Irishness here is associated with barbarity, with violence, with all of these negative things. Irishness is othered, of course, in this perspective from London. So it's not surprising, therefore, that a Dubliner should produce a novel of such Gothic proportions in 1890, the late 1890s. That is Bram Stoker's Dracula. And one of the interesting things about Stoker's novel is how do we read it? So there are perhaps two ways of looking at it. In one way, you could say, is this a critique of the shameful habits of the aristocracy, the landlords who are sucking the peasantry dry, and a reflection on those forces and powers in Ireland? Perhaps. Myself, I think it may be more correct to see Dracula as a narrative that expresses the anxieties of the descending ascendancy, rather than those of the rising peasant class. And that comes through if you look at that book and how it represents Catholicism, for example, in the opening passages of the book. Okay, it's not set in Ireland, but a lot of the kind of folk practices and the Catholic practices and so forth are seen as very dubious and scary. And in some respects, I think that's Bram Stoker working out his anxieties around Irish Catholicism. Remember, the Anglo-Irish ascendancy were very much a minority within Ireland. And I think of significance is, for that class, the narrative of Irish nationalism as a revolutionary entity that keeps coming back and can't be killed off is something which gets expressed through Dracula. So in some ways, I think you can read that novel as really about the fears of the descending ascendancy rather than about the peasant class. But that's just one to interpret it. So when we come to the end of the 19th century, we have come through the famine. We've come through a period of agrarian unrest and land wars. We have this figure in politics, Charles Stewart Parnell, who's tried to bring a measure of independence to Ireland. That's failed. And as a result of that failure, the nationalist political party in Ireland splits into two groups. Those who support Parnell on one side and those who are against him on the other side. It's a complex story. I won't go into details now. But let's just say it's a little bit like what I can see in the UK now, in Brexit. So the UK is quite paralyzed now between, are you for Brexit? Are you against Brexit? Are you for it? Are you against? Are you for it? Are you against? They're kind of stuck in this battle between something which happened, what is it now, 5, 6, 7 years ago. So Ireland in the late 19th century was like that. People were, paralyzed in this moment about something that had happened a decade before. So that's why I would say just before the revival happens, or perhaps one of the impetuses to the revival is to break. How do we break through this paralysis? How do we move ourselves into a different moment? So a very key figure here is Douglas Hyde, who was one of the great cultural leaders of the time. He was a great supporter of the Irish language and the movement to get people speaking Irish again. He was involved in the founding of the Gaelic League. And he wrote this very influential essay, The Necessity for De-Anglicizing Ireland, in 1893. Now, the title kind of tells you everything you need to know. La necesidad de desanglicanizar Irlanda tells you really what this is. So basically what he's saying is that Irish people need to value their own culture. They need to get rid of the kind of colonial ideas of it as it being a bad thing or a negative thing. But also that Ireland needs to become a centre of innovation again. What's happened now is Irish people are always looking to London as that's the place where everything happens. That's where all the solutions are. That's where all the innovation is. So just to give you a quotation, he says, "We must create a strong feeling against West Britanism." Now, West Britanism was the idea that Ireland was a Western province of Britain. Okay, we must create a strong feeling against West Britain. We shall find ourselves toiling painfully behind the English at each step, following the same fashions, only 6 months behind the English ones. We will become a nation of imitators, lost to the power of native initiative. So that last line there is the one that resonates with me. That the Irish had become a nation of imitators, imitating the English language, imitating British English literature, English fashions, English everything. So he's saying, that's not a good place to be. And he points out an element of paralysis there, because he's saying, on the one hand, you profess to be hostile to all things British, but now you're actually imitating them. So, which is it? You can't have it both ways. So this begins to start a conversation about a new way, a new possibility, a new way forward for Irish culture. And back to my old friend James Singh again. A few years after this, he writes, "The linguistic atmosphere of Ireland has become definitely English enough for the first time to allow work to be done in English that is perfectly Irish in its essence, yet has sureness and purity of form." And what he means by that is, now that English has taken hold, we can't get rid of it overnight. It's a reality. So this is the dreamer leaning into reality again. We have the ability to generate a great literature in the English language that is securely Irish, that is securely of our place, that reflects our realities, that reflects the way we speak English, that reflects our traditions, our folklore. So we can't wait until the Irish language comes back in 50 years to start writing a literature. We need to do it now. And one of the most extraordinary things is that we get this amazing burst of literature in Ireland during this period, across drama. We think of the emergence of the Abbey Theatre, across fiction, James Joyce, of course, being the great example, not the only one, and across poetry, people like W.B. Yeats, recognized with the Nobel Prize for literature as our great poet. There he is, the said W.B. Yeats. So in 1893, around the same time as Douglas Hyde's writing The Necessity for de-Anglicising Ireland, one of his most famous poems. So if you know one poem by W.B. Yeats, the chances are this is the one you've heard of. It's called The Lake Isle of Innisfree. And I'll just read through it very quickly. I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, a hive for the honey bee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade. And I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the vales of the morning to where the cricket sings. There midnight's all a glimmer, and noon a purple glow, and evening full of the linnet's wings. I will arise and go now, for always night and day I hear lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore. While I stand on the roadway or the pavement's grey, I hear it in the deep heart's core. Okay, so very famous poem, inspired by a place that was very dear to his heart, County Sligo. And this is the place which inspired that poem. Now, the important thing is, when Yeats wrote that poem, he was living in London. And he was thinking about Ireland and its purchase on his imagination. So the poem is essentially, I suppose, a manifesto of self-help, if you think about it. He's saying, I want to go to a place, I want to build my own house, I want to cultivate my own crops, I want to be self-sufficient, I want to live that simple, self-sufficient life, which in many respects became a kind of a manifesto for the Irish nation. You know, the whole idea of self-help and self-sufficiency and not looking to London and let's do it ourselves and let's find our own solutions to our own problems becomes the major question of this period. But also importantly, Yeats is saying, I want to go back to Ireland. I want to leave London and go back to Ireland and make that my home and see in Ireland the possibilities of imagination and of living a fulfilled life. So what he's doing here is he's reversing the trajectory of the thousands of people leaving Ireland at this time. Okay, so he's changing the narrative. If you remember back to the 19th century, Ireland, particularly rural Ireland, is a Gothic landscape, deathly, a place to be escaped from. And now he's presenting it as this is a place to escape to. This is a place of nourishment. So that's what the revival does. That's what the literary revival does. It changes the narrative about Irish possibility. So it's in the realm of imagination, but it's also connected to the real questions that were being asked at the time. And just to give you a more landscape here, this is Ben Bulben, a famous mountain in County Sligo that inspired Yeats. You may have heard of it before, and he's buried just below that mountain in Drumcliff Church. Another quick example of Yeats's poetry from this period, because he was also really interested, and this gets us back into the realm of fantastic again, interested in folklore and interested in Irish oral culture, the stories that the ordinary people told, and that were very much in his ears as he was a child growing up and visiting these places in Sligo. And he gets really interested in the world of the fairies, fairyland. And this poem, this is just an extract from the poem, The Stolen Child, which illustrates that. Where dips the rocky highland and Fluthwood in the lake, there lies a leafy island where flapping herons wake the drowsy water rats. There we've hid our fairy vats, full of berries and the reddest stolen cherries. Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. So this idea of the two realms and the interaction between the two realms and the fact that that's very much present in Irish oral culture at this time was very attractive to him and becomes very, very important to the kind of, well, there's very clear connections here with kind of pre-Raphaelite poetry and literature as well. But this, again, begins to see a very different use of the folklore than the one we find in Bram Stoker's Dracula, where it's something to be recoiled from and to fear and to be eradicated. In this case, by Yeats, it's actually the opposite. It's something which is nourishing and helpful. Now, as I said, it was also a period of dissension. Like not everybody thought the same thing. So there were other people at the time who believed that actually it was a battle of two civilizations going on in Ireland, between the ascendancy, the Anglo-Irish ascendancy, and the Catholic Gaelic people. And one of these people was this man called D.P. Moran, who wrote the following: "What is Irish literature? And if we are to pay for it, where are we to get it? We are in a period of rapid transition in regard to this matter. The great body think, or rather, they don't think, but have a hazy idea that Irish literature is to be discovered in the English language, or nebulous twaddle labelled the Celtic note. Any man may be safely defied to define what is Irish literature in the English language." So in other words, what he's saying is, this idea that you can have an Irish literature in the English language is rubbish, is to be disregarded. That if you want a literature that's absolutely Irish, it has to be in the Irish language. So he preferred to see it as a battle of two civilizations rather than the Yeatsian idea or the idea from Synge. So what I would say is, one of the kind of interesting but confusing things about this period is all of this debate about, what Irishness is. It's not an agreed category. There are lots of different versions of what this is. So I'm going to say there are kind of four competing ideas at this time. First of all, there's the idea that Irishness is marked out by the language. So when in England they speak English, in France they speak French, in Spanish, in Spain they speak Spanish. I know that's controversial. That's in this room. But therefore, in Ireland we should speak Irish, and that what makes us Irish is our language. Okay. So this is an idea that we get with the Gaelic League, and it's invested in the idea of a literature in the Irish language, as I've just mentioned there. A second idea is that what makes the Irish distinct, particularly in a British Isles context, is the Catholic religion. What makes the Irish people distinct is that they held on to the Catholic religion to their material disadvantage, particularly during the Reformation. And what makes the Irish people distinctive and a different nation is precisely that. So that's an idea that goes to that statue there is of Daniel O'Connell, the leader of Catholic emancipation, but it's an idea of Irishness that celebrates early Irish Christianity, the round towers and the Celtic crosses and the old monasteries and the early Christian art and so forth. That idea culturally is the expression of that. The third idea is what actually makes us Irish is that we have this amazing pre-Christian heritage. Ireland was never Romanized. The Romans never came to Ireland, so we have this great Celtic culture that goes way back to ancient Ireland, way before Protestants and Catholics. And this is the Ireland of the dolmens that we have here, and the passage graves, and the Neolithic tombs, and the sense of spirituality that comes from that great Celtic idea. A lot of people like that idea because it doesn't matter if you're Catholic or Protestant in early Christian Ireland, or sorry, in pre-Christian Ireland. It's not an issue. So it transcends that particular one, and that's culturally expressed in an interest in the myths and the legends around the great heroes of this that were being rediscovered at this time. So the stories of Finn McCool and Cuchulainn and the Fianna and these warriors from this period are made known and are translated at this time and are hugely present in the culture. The fourth one then is a political identity. And this is the idea. What makes the Irish distinctive, again in the British Isles context, is republicanism. We are repugnant of the idea of monarchy. We don't like the idea of kings and queens. We don't like that notion of a hierarchy. We believe in the idea of citizenship. It's an idea that goes back to, obviously, the French Revolution. And here in the image we have Theobald Wolfe-Tone, who was the leader of the United Irishmen Rebellion in 1798. It was a failed rebellion, but it was an attempt to create a republic in Ireland at this time. And, of course, it gets a later expression then during the revolution in 1916. So this is the proclamation of the Irish Republic in 1916, which we regard as the origin of the modern Irish state. And just a quick aside here is the opening statement is, Irishmen and Irish women, I'm sorry, you probably can't read, it's too small. In the name of God and the dead generations from which she receives her old tradition of nationhood, Ireland through us summons her children to her flag and strikes for her freedom. Now, what I always find interesting here is in the name of God and the dead generations. Okay, so it's going back to, it's saying that our power now resides in the fact that there were people before us who revolted and had revolutions, and people before them who revolted had revolutions, and people before them. And so we get power from that. So if there is an Irish nationalist teleology, if you want to use that concept, it's the idea that someday the nation will finally take its place among the nations of this earth. So getting back against the Bram Stoker, so if you're the Anglo-Irish ascendancy living in the big house, this is the thing you fear. This is the thing that cannot be killed. This is the thing that's causing you the most trepidation, and perhaps gets expressed through the Gothic literature in that respect. Okay, so let's gather in some ideas now. So what are we seeing here? So some of the ideas emerging during the revival are the revival as a progressive moment, I think, of radical activism. All these things are happening around political sovereignty, but there's also a lot happening around female suffrage as well, the right of women to vote, around trade unionism and class politics, agricultural cooperatives, the questioning of empire. We also see the questioning of Christianity, particularly in the literary set. They get interested in theosophy and alternative systems of belief, and that whole realm. We get people critiquing capitalism, people like James Connolly, who are reading their Marx and interested in all of those. So all of these things are happening. Irish people are discovering themselves as citizens as well. So it's an amazing moment where people are becoming active. They're getting involved in societies and clubs and theatres and so on, and gathering all over the country to do things that they'd never had done before. And this idea of tradition as a springboard for modernity, as I say. And then, of course, the decolonizing impulse within Irish cultural discourse. How can we present ourselves to the world in a way that is positive and empowering and also displaces those older colonial stereotypes that we've inherited, that we looked at, the Frankensteins and all of that kind of stuff. So a good example of the activity and the energy in Ireland at this time is from this writer, Mary Collum, from Life and the Dream, where she says, Dublin bristled with movements of various kinds, dramatic, artistic, educational. There were movements for the restoration of the Irish language, for reviving native arts and crafts, for preserving ancient ruins, for resurrecting native costume, an array of political movements. Here too were the theatres and the tea rooms and pubs, which corresponded to the cafe life of the continental city. In the centre too were the headquarters of the clubs and societies, some at war with each other, but all exciting and somehow focused towards one end, a renaissance. So this is the whole idea of a renaissance, that revival, which has lots of similarities, of course, with something like the Italian Renaissance, where it's looking back to look forward, discovering something of the power of a culture that's past, that was forgotten, that was subterranean, disinterring it and being empowered with it as you move forward. So, here's a very interesting one as well. Again, when I spoke about the connection between the imaginative realm, the artistic realm, and the material realm, the people working on the ground to change Ireland, this newspaper, the Irish Homestead, was the newspaper of the Irish agricultural movement, the organ of Irish agricultural and industrial development. So you can see here, sorry, it's a bit small, but you can see there are articles here about agriculture, poultry, beekeeping, creamery management, all of these things, which are of interest to farmers and people involved with agricultural cooperation and so forth. But if you look, and you could maybe miss it, at the very bottom here, our weekly story, The Sisters, by Stephen Dedalus. Now, Stephen Dedalus was the pen name of James Joyce. So this is the first time James Joyce had a work of fiction published. And it happens in the agricultural paper. So it's a kind of a funny place. Not a literary paper, not a select, avant-garde journal, but in the paper that the farmers and the ordinary people of Ireland are reading at this time. And there it is. I looked it up and I took a photograph because I think it's really interesting. So a number of his stories were published in this journal that were later collected in his collection, Dubliners. And if any of you know your James Joyce, you know that Dubliners, the central theme of that novel is paralysis. The idea that society is stuck, that there are all sorts of problems and issues, and how do we get over that paralysis? So I would align James Joyce's work with the work of the artists. Oftentimes Joyce and the Yeats and the Lady Gregorys and the Synges are seen as in different camps or different spheres. Actually, I would say they have as much in common as they have, differences. And it's sometimes important to align them as well as to be aware of the differences between them. So that's that. So let's move now to the Abbey Theatre, which is what I want to concentrate now on mostly for the remainder of of my remarks this morning. So the Abbey Theatre was founded in 1904. This is the original premises. It burnt down in a fire in 1955. It's now being rebuilt. And somebody cruelly wrote in the newspaper when it burnt down in 1955 that the fire was the most dramatic thing that happened there in many years, which I think was a little cruel. However, it did, yes, those years in the 50s were probably not its greatest years, but its early years was very much a place of energy. Like all of the movements at this time, it had a manifesto. And in the manifesto, these words appear. We will show that Ireland is not the home of buffoonery and easy sentiment, as it has been represented, but the home of an ancient idealism. So you can see the ways in which this artistic, this project in the realm of the imagination and creativity is also aware of its context and what's happening and how it should align itself in relation to that. So essentially what they're saying is before its arrival, there were, of course, lots of theatres, particularly in Dublin, but a lot of the theatres in Dublin were like venues which had visiting companies, mostly from the UK. So it was possible to see a lot of theatre, but most of it was visiting from elsewhere. So the idea behind the Abbey was, let's create a theatre that will produce Irish plays for Irish audiences written by Irish playwrights. Simple enough idea, but it didn't exist before then. So that's what they're trying to achieve. What they're trying to achieve here. Lady Gregory was a key member of it, as was Alice Milligan in the early years, and she wrote one of the early plays called The Last Feast of Fianna. And you can see there on the image on the right-hand side, what she was trying to do was go back to ancient Ireland, the time of the warriors and the Celtic stories, and bring that onto the stage and make that part of the Irish theatre. So the theatre becomes a kind of an arena in which, remember those four strands of Irish identity I mentioned? The theatre becomes the place where they are embodied and presented to the nation. And different writers have different ideas of what the nation should be or what the nation should look like. And that's why some of the things there were very successful and applauded, and others were not accepted. Another interesting context here to one of the important plays that was presented, I'll get to the play in a second. It's a play called Kathleen y Houlihan in 1902, was the visit of Queen Victoria to Dublin in 1900. And one of the major, that was a very controversial visit. There was a very orchestrated protest against that visit. Maud Gonne, who was a famous nationalist organizer at this time, also the love of W.B. Yeats, although it was an unrequited love. He loved her, she didn't love him. Basically organized a massive protest against the Queen. Now, what's interesting, she wrote an essay, and I'm getting back again to the Gothic and all of that kind of stuff, and she published an essay in one of the newspapers called The Famine Queen, about Queen Victoria. And basically she was saying that every eviction that took place during the 63 years has been carried out in Victoria's name. She was reminding the audience that if you're trying to look for who's responsible for all the bad things that happened, it's Queen Victoria. And she also pointed out, and it's in this quotation, soldiers are needed to protect the vampires. Soldiers must be found. So Victoria will go herself to fetch them. She will go over to Ireland, to this people who have despised gold and who, in spite of persecutions and threats, have persisted in their dream of freedom and idealism, and who, though reduced in numbers, have maintained all the beauty and strength and vitality of their race. So what was this is about the British were involved in a war in South Africa at this time, the Boer War, and Victoria was basically sent to Dublin to recruit soldiers for that war. And Maud Gonne is calling that out and saying, we won't be part of this. She's like a vampire. So again, interesting how the discourse of the vampire is very much there. Yeats also wrote an essay at this time called Noble and Ignoble Loyalty. So in other words, who should you be loyal to? What's the noble thing to be loyal to? What's the ignoble thing? And he says, her visits to Ireland have indeed been unfortunate for English power, for they have commonly foreshadowed a fierce and sudden shaking of English power in Ireland. I see all around me, among the young men who hold the coming years in their hands, a new awakening inspiration and resolve. So in other words, he can see, actually, something is happening. Something is starting to stir. The young people now actually are thinking differently, and it's quite a prophetic thing that he wrote. Anyway, Yeats and Lady Gregory wrote a play called Kathleen Ni Houlihan in 1902. And what they're doing there is presenting a counter-exemplar to Queen Victoria. So Kathleen Ni Houlihan is a personification. It's an old idea of Ireland as personified by a woman. And this woman is the one that the Irish people should be loyal to, not Queen Victoria. And this is a scene from the play. The Kathleen Ni Houlihan was played by Maud Gonne here. And in the story, she goes into a peasant cottage to try and get back her 4 beautiful green fields. And the 4 green fields represent the 4 provinces of Ireland. And the idea is she wants the young man of the house to come with her to help her get the fields back. And when he goes with her at the end, she's transformed from an old woman into a beautiful young woman with the walk of the Queen. So it's quite a straightforward Republican allegory, actually. This is another image that was slightly later, but just to give you an idea of this Kathleen Ni Houlihan image, which is something which goes back to poetry in the Irish language, so that what we call the Ashling tradition, which I don't really have time to get into now. But the point being, obviously, the political connection, but it's the way in which the revival is also mining Gaelic literature and Gaelic culture and bringing that influence into an Irish literature in the English language at this time. Moving quickly on to John Millington Synge, who was famous for his play, The Playboy of the Western World, which was staged in the Abbey Theatre in 1904. There's an image here. This is from a painting depicting the hero, Christy Mahan, killing his father, old Mahan. So it really it's a kind of an Irish version of the Oedipus story, really. That's what it is. But what's distinctive about it is the way Synge uses Irish dialect in a very interesting and imaginative way, very poetic way, and celebrates that. Again, it's this whole idea of making a literature, dramatic literature in the English language, which is securely and innovatively Irish at the same time. It didn't go well, the first production. So see, this is from the newspaper. The Abbey Theatre, uproarious scenes, protests against Mr. Synge's play. The police called in. Peace acted in dumb show. So didn't go well. Some people didn't like it. They didn't like the idea that Synge was using violence on stage. They said, well, this is too close to colonial stereotypes. So they didn't like it, and they tried to close the play down. And this ad appeared as well. Support the Abbey Theatre against organised interruption. Uphold the right of every man to hear and judge for himself. Okay, very gendered language, certainly, but what I like about this is, again, the idea of freedom of expression and freedom of speech was something which they held very dearly at this time. Nobody had the right to determine who should see or who should hear or be censorious in that way. Now, a decade or two later, during independence, Ireland actually became very censorious. We had a very draconian censorship of publications, a very draconian censorship of film, and sometimes it's nice to be reminded of that earlier time, which was, in fact, in some ways more liberal. So Yeats made a very interesting speech. He said nobody basically has the right to prevent people from hearing and judging for themselves. And that was something that he held on to very, very dearly. And what was the message of the play? Well, the message of the play was really siding with the marginalized against the powerful. That's what this play is all about, against the kind of settled orthodoxies of Irish life. And it's widely regarded now as one of the greatest plays ever written. And it's taken the audience a little bit of time to catch up with it, actually. And sometimes that happens, that, avant-garde writers or, it takes a while for people to catch up with their revolutionary ideas. And that's the case with Singh. But one of the things I would say about him is he was very keen on pointing out the sectional interests in Ireland. And there's a great quotation where he says he's very much working against what he called the groggy, patriot, publican, general shopman who was married to the priest's half-sister and a second cousin once removed of the dispensary doctor. It's a great, great little phrase, because he's saying that Ireland is controlled by the people, the professions, by the clergy, and by the shopkeepers. And that's the class that's keeping everybody. So the colonial element is important, but let's not forget that there are other elements within that we need to critique. So his play is all about a visceral and subversive act of defiance. And many of his plays are actually. And that's what makes them so powerful. Yeats, of course, celebrated and championed him in this short poem on those who hated the playboy of the Western world. Once, when midnight smote the air, eunuchs run through hell and met on every crowded street to stare upon great Juan riding by, even like these to rail and sweat, staring upon his sinewy thigh. So again, the idea of the artist as, as being powerful and as being able to transform society is a deeply, deeply important one here as well. So I'm going to come to an end now by saying that what's interesting is when Yeats was finally awarded his Nobel Prize in 1922, he actually looked back to that time of the theatre. And what I find really interesting is in this movement, which really was ad hoc, it was like amateur drama, people coming together to start up this theatre. And within 2 decades, one of its leading members had won the Nobel Prize for Literature. The theatre was widely regarded internationally, and Yeats name checks it in his Nobel speech. And maybe my final point is they went on a tour of the United States in 1911, and one of the people in the theatre was one Eugene O'Neill, famous American playwright. And O'Neill said, "It was seeing the Irish players for the first time that gave me a glimpse of my opportunity. The first year that they came over here, I went to see everything they did. I thought then, and I still think, that they demonstrated the possibilities and naturalistic acting better than any other company." So again, I just say that to illustrate how quickly the influence of the work escaped Ireland and began to have an impact internationally as well. So time has probably escaped me now at this point, so I think that might be a good point to stop. So thank you so much for your attention this morning, and great to be here. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot, Professor Matthews, for this amazing lecture. And well, I think we may have questions, comments for Professor Matthews. We have great experts on Irish culture here, so well, it's your time. So when you are ready, please, and we have a mic over there. Questions, comments, complaints?
No complaints at all.
Right, thank you very much for your lecture, and I'll just break the ice a little here. Working? It's all right, okay. For some of us, I would say many of us over here, and students of Irish literature and also Basque literature, I don't know whether you're aware that there was a adaptation of Catalan Hulchan. That adaptation was published here in the Basque Country and was actually bilingual. It was in Basque and in Irish. It was published in 1933 by, if I'm not mistaken, the name in Basque was Negarres Igaros San Achua by Altuna, and La Vieja que se fue llorando by Sota Aburto. That was published in 1993 within the movement that in Basque, and excuse my Basque, or I am from the old generation, was Euskal Pizkundea. That is also the Basque revival. And it is really interesting to see that many of the ideas you were talking about today, about the Irish revival, dealing with music, language, politics, history, and tradition, and of course the idea of the creation also of political parties and reactions against a different type of colonialism, if you allow me that, within our discourse or our historical discourse. I mean, we're actually duplicated. I wouldn't say copied, all right, but transferred into these this translation, bilingual translation. And this is something that always has puzzled me, that in this translation they went for the bilingual, that is the two languages. Many of the plays of the revival, if not to say most of them, were written in English. Yeah. And even the idea of translating those plays into Irish was not something that was actually good seen, even by the authors themselves, like Yeats or Gregory and Synge. How did the politics of language, right, got into the picture here?
Great question, and a very complex one. First of all, what you say resonates really, really strongly, and just being here and from what I know about Basque culture and history, I often feel the resonance. Actually, I often feel, there's similar questions and there's similar dynamic and so forth. So I'm definitely with you on that one. The interesting thing about the Irish language is the people who are leading the revival of the Irish language for the most part at this time are the intellectuals, the Douglas Hydes and the Patrick Pearses and so forth. They're not native speakers of the language. So they can write it and they can write creatively in it, but they can't necessarily speak it very well. Meanwhile, the people who can speak it fluently can't write it because they're an illiterate peasantry. So you have a very disconnected system in many respects, which makes it difficult to initiate the kind of actions you're talking about, and also particularly in the theatre as well. So the Irish poetic tradition is a very strong one. So it goes back 1,000 years, but we never really had a Gaelic theatre, because at the very time when theatre all over Europe is taking off in the 17th century or whatever, that's the very time that Gaelic Ireland is collapsing. So for us, a key date is 1607, the flight of the Earls. That's, we say, is the kind of the end of that ancient Gaelic world. So that actually represents the moment when theatre all over Europe is beginning to flourish. Doesn't happen in the Irish language, so that might also be an impediment. What's really interesting now, though, is how now, more than 100 years later, we're going through another revival. So I spoke to some people, and some of you may or may not have heard of a film called The Quiet Girl on Colleen Keown, which was nominated for an Oscar 3-4 years ago now, which never happened before. So the idea that an Irish language film could be an internationally successful one is a new idea for us. It's like, wow, So maybe these things take time. And also, interestingly, now there is, some people in the audience may have heard of NECAP, an Irish language rap group from Northern Ireland. Some people are nodding their heads, and they're doing something again interesting and new with the Irish language. And I know I can see it. I know on campus you hear more Irish language spoken now. So maybe these things take time, and those ruptures are difficult to immediately overcome. But it's a good question, and I'm not sure if I'm answering it appropriately for you, but yeah.
Okay, we have still 5 minutes for questions, comments. Anybody else from the audience? I have just in case. I think sort of question connected to what you have said. You have talked about this diversity in terms of Irishness, the 4 different approaches, and then last night when I was doing my homework about this particular lecture, I found my old edition of the classic Irish drama, and there's this preface or introduction by W.A. Armstrong, and maybe we will simply quote from this. To W.B. Yeats, the prime founder of the Irish dramatic movement, the cultural unity of his nation was to be created by dramatizing Irish myths and legends and by their performance awakening heroic passions dormant in the racial memory. I think it's an interesting quotation. This emphasis on looking for cultural unity based on the past, based on folklore, on myths, on fantasy. I don't know if you could expand on this, in the sense that there's sort of an obsession about cultural unity. I mean, particularly nowadays we think about diversity as well, bonus for many things, but looking back to find some kind of unity, I guess that maybe we need to contextualize this properly. It's not really a question. But
No, it's a good point. It's actually a very interesting point. And, you know, to some degrees, I think what that is and what there's, I think there's two things here. I think that the approach to go back in many respects is an answer to colonial attitudes. So what the colonizer does, it comes in and says, see what you're doing, see that's your tradition, and you do, that has to go. We have to get rid of that. And you need to do this thing that we're giving you, right? So what colonialism does is replaces, you know, the indigenous way of doing things, wipes it out, destroys it, and tries to put something in its place. One of the dynamics in the Irish revival is, well, actually, there's some good things in our tradition. Mm-hmm. You know, our tradition isn't always a bad thing. It isn't something that to be walked away from, for to be ashamed of. It's actually something that we need to be proud of. So we need to go back and see what in our tradition is enabling and that can help us going forward. So I think there's a lot of that going in there. In terms specifically to the theatre, Yeats believed, and he was primarily a poet, but he knew that the vast majority of Irish people were not going to sit down and read his poetry, much and all as you might want them to. But anybody can go to the theatre. You don't have to be anybody. You don't have to be the literate person. Anyone can go to the theatre and be transformed and engaged by what happens before you on the stage and leave differently. So I think he did see something of that kind of almost religious experience of the theatre. So that's why the investment in the poetic theatre. And now, so I would suggest those two things. Not everyone agreed with Yeats, of course.
Okay.
but I would suggest those 2 points.
Thank you. Any final comments, remarks, questions? No?
All good.
Okay, thank you so much. Millas Care, muchísimas gracias.
Gracias a todos. Thank you.